super excited that your book exists. I mean, it's really meaningful. I think, one of the factors is that I think, especially in the United States, the way the career of being a hairdresser is looked at, right? It can be looked at as kind of like a good enough career or a dropout career. And I think that that's like kind of a stigma that is in the back of a lot of people's heads, and when you've given your life and your career or your life to this career, it can kind of be a bummer to have that kind of stigma. So it's cool to have some history, something tangible that we can look to.
That is exactly what I'm hoping this book, Beyond Vanity, The History and Power of Hairdressing, will do. I mean, the hairdressing profession has a long history, a long legacy, and we're seeing it continue today. And it breaks my heart when I hear, people say, oh, I was a hairdresser, but I just, I needed to do something different, or my family wanted me to do something different, or what have you. Just this morning, as you know, I work at an art museum here in New York. And just this morning, a new acquaintance had asked me to get together for a coffee, and we met in the cafeteria. And we just knew each other through like museum circle stuff. And then she said, Liz, did you know I'm a hairdresser and I own a salon? Yeah. And I was like, no, I didn't know that. And also, why wouldn't that be the first thing that you tell me? And she's like, yeah, my husband and I own a salon with we have 35 staff members, 10,000 square feet in Connecticut.
Wow.
I know. And I was like, just tell me everything. I was like, do you do extensions? Do you do braids? Like, I have a million questions about hairdressing, and that has continued for the years that I've been doing this research.
Yeah. I was listening to an interview with you on, I think the podcast is called Dressed.
Yes.
Yeah. And, yeah. And it was really cool because they're mostly talking about clothes, and when they mentioned the history or the correlation with hairdressing, you really lit up, which I thought was cool.
So yeah, I've heard other people say that too. And it's interesting that you picked up on that, because I'm an art historian by training and have a PhD. My area of specialty is late 19th century American painting. So painters in the US after the Civil War until the turn of the century, around 1900. And so some of those painters in that circle would be John Singer Sargent, Winslow Homer, Mary Cassatt, and on and on and on. And what I ended up writing my dissertation on in graduate school was representations of women's hairstyles in American painting. So that I worked, 5 years on that specialty, wrote the dissertation, and I kept calling it, I referred to it to my advisors as the topic, as the gift that keeps on giving. And I finished the dissertation several years ago, and I thought that hairdressing representations of women's hair and hairdressing would be the topic that I would write straight out of school and into my first book. And that's not what happened. I started that way. I started writing about women with red hair in paintings of that period. And it was going really well. And then it started veering into fashion, like what they were wearing. And so that's probably what you mostly heard me speak about on that other one, in that other conversation. And that too is a fashion. So I wrote a book on Gilded Age fashion and the women in the United States who were buying fashion in France and spending thousands of dollars in the late 19th century, which is the equivalent of, say, like $30,000 today on a single dress. Women's patronage, the power that they had in buying French couture.
So just pausing there.
Yeah.
How did you not end up a designer or a hairdresser? Like, what took you into art history?
Oh, yeah. Nobody wants me doing their hair. And also no one wants me like painting a landscape or anything like that. But I've always loved, being around artists and creative people, but I am absolutely, an observer and a studier and a researcher and writer and not a practitioner. So I think that's why I get so, excited when I talk to people who are actually, in the salon or behind the chair or, meeting clients and coming up with editorial work and all that. So that's a really fun question. Thank you for asking that one. But I did think that I would write about, hairstyles first. And then somehow I got pulled into the fashion history and love it. We'll continue on that too. But now with Beyond Vanity, I'm circling back to my first, love, my first topic, which was the hairstyles. So it's just really a joy to be deep into it.
It seems like obviously those two worlds are so intertwined that probably doing that book was still good research and development for this book, right?
You got it. And that was one of the major points that I made in my first book, Dressing Up, which is that in France at the time, which is what I was focusing on there, the professions were so closely linked. So when you study fashion of the period, you can't study responsibly. You can't responsibly study fashion without studying hairstyling and perfumery and millinery, people who are making the hats and also people who are making shoes and undergarments. I mean, these industries were all linked then the way that they all circle around each other now. And there was competition in France at that time between the, practitioners, between the specialists, but also a lot of incredible collaboration, which is what I try to draw attention to. But the hairdressers, they were central to the culture, and women sitting down with hairdressers to get their hair done before going to a major event and wearing one of those dresses that cost thousands of dollars. The dress was useless unless they had their hair styled. They couldn't go to the opera or to a gala event without having their hair styled. And they needed a professional in order to do it.
Right. So in my research, hearing stuff you've talked about, I noticed that you mentioned kind of the fashion industry, because of silk and importing, it came kind of through Lyon, France, right? Which is also kind of considered like a food capital, or the food capital, as I understand it, right? Would you say it's similar to with hair? Would hairdressing as we know it have started in that same place?
Hairdressing, as with fashion, like haute couture, which was then just called couture, absolutely started professionalizing in France and throughout Europe before in the United States. Always. I mean, style comes from style starts in France. It really always does. And then it disseminates. So yes, it did. And what's really fun about studying hairdressers of early periods in France is that they sort of had they were men. The ones whose names were recorded were men, and they went by single names, which I love. So you see in like the newspapers or in the periodicals, these hairdressers who are, just called like Albert or Leonard, and it's just the first name. And there was one who's considered the first. I think he was Marie Antoinette's hairdresser, and he went by Champagne, like champagne. So I love that question about the relationship with food. There's also a direct relationship between food and hair products of the period in coming up a little bit later after those single name guys I was talking about, but into the mid 19th century, late 19th century, these products were these hair, concoctions that people were coming up with in their kitchens were highly based on foodstuffs, so the ingredients that you see in the recipes for shampoo and for what they called restorers, and you'll know, and your listeners will know better than I, but many of these hair products were marketed as restorers. And I don't know if that was like a serum type, you know, texture or like more, you know, oily based. But all of the products promise, they all promise the same thing. They all promise to reverse gray,
Mhm.
familiar, and they all promise to restore the health of your hair. So, sort of assuming that you had lost the health of your hair and that you were buying this product to restore it. And they were made with household ingredients. So, I often think of the zillions and zillions of recipes in these etiquette books that were shampoos made with egg yolks. And there's one for just, you know, off the top, like 3 egg yolks, castor oil, and then like a squeeze of apple juice to offset the scent, perhaps, of the egg yolks. And, you know, maybe you can tell me, like, what were they after with the egg yolks and the castor oil? Like, was that for like a sheen or a
I mean,
gloss?
I assume it all kind of comes down to moisture, but that would be that would probably be something that you would look to wash out of your hair rather than it doing the washing of your hair. It's kind of fun.
That's such a good point. The moisture, I love how you said that because I look at a lot of images of women from the period and a lot of photographs. They're black and white, and like, their hair really looks dry. They weren't. So they were washing their hair no more often than once every 2 weeks. So the etiquette books would recommend once every 2 weeks or once every 3 weeks, and in some cases once every month. So it gets exaggerated at times, and people will say, oh, well, women in the 19th century only washed their hair once a month. It varied, as with, you know, everything varies. But I would say probably the average is once every 2 weeks. And, you know, so when you see these photographs of like socialite women and also of actresses, especially the actresses who were photographed more often, their hair looks kind of, you know, dry. And I don't know if that's because they weren't washing it as much, but then also, and you and your industry professionals can tell me more about this, but they were putting in a lot of pieces. So they were putting in, if they could afford it, real extensions, basically like real hair braids to bulk up their hair so that they could get those updos that were the style of the moment.
What era are we talking about here?
Okay, so right now I'm talking like 1860s to 1900.
And still, are we still in France, or is this already coming over to the U.S.?
We'll talk about the United States context, yes.
Okay, cool.
Thanks for setting that up.
Yeah.
So they were buying hair pieces and putting them, having their hairstylist bulk up their hair so that they could get the styles that they wanted. And I'm guessing from what I've read that there was different quality of hair pieces that were going in. So maybe some were not fully human hair, and maybe those are what I'm seeing in the photographs that look a little more frayed, if you will.
Right, for sure. Yeah, I would imagine so. I mean, it's still similar today. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a professional photograph of a model or an actress that does not have hair added to the picture, you know, in photographs.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
So as far as, you know, so you said we were talking about Marie Antoinette and her hairdresser, right? Was having a hairdresser a matter of wealth?
Very much so.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, very much so. So we'll come back into the time period of the book. So 1860s to 1900, post Civil War to turn of the century, you have this massive discrepancy in class and wealth in the US. Some people are getting extremely wealthy off of industrialization, railroads. The wives, sisters, mothers are spending incredible amounts of money on their lifestyle and also on, beauty and hair and fashion. And so you, depending on your means, you would either have your personal maid do your hair at home. So some people could afford that, which would be, I guess, the ideal, because then you wouldn't have to make an appointment. But then there were sort of elite hairdressers. And I'm talking right now about the major cities in the United States. So let's say New York, Chicago, New Orleans, Cleveland, Ohio. If you had the means and you could afford to go to one of the elite hairdressers who had their own proto salon, it wouldn't have been called a salon at that time. It probably would have been called hair rooms or a saloon even. Then you would go to really an elite stylist who would either have been trained in France or would claim to have been trained in France.
Yes. Okay.
And then if you could not afford an elite hairstylist, or if you didn't have your personal, made at home, you probably would have a friend do your hair, or your sister do your hair, or a neighbor do your hair. Really cool.
It is really cool. Was there were there many hairdressers traveling from Europe to the United States in order to practice at that time?
It's really difficult to track exactly this. It's really difficult to track this industry. What we can go on are, and question them along the way, are like newspaper reports and business, like city directories. And for sure, there were some professional hairdressers coming from France to the United States and setting up shop.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And probably training a few hairdressers after them. But then there are a lot of people who would say in their newspaper advertisements that, Madam, Jones trained in Paris, and
Right.
just leave it at that. So there wasn't as much questioning of the credentials that you advertised, but it really didn't matter. It was just sort of like, a cachet that you would kind of put in your advertisement or on your product, like on a label on a bottle. And if you could do hair, you could do hair, right? I mean, if you did a good job, people came back to you. You could really call yourself whatever you want. There are a lot of people who called themselves Monsieur so-and-so and Madame so-and-so. I mean,
Right.
it's constant in the directories, and, anyone could really call themselves that.
Man, that's quite interesting. So, how would you say, for the culture of hairdressing, how was the United States really significant? Because I think even now it's a little bit skipped over still. Like, we think still about French hairdressing, even British and Italian hairdressing. It's really kind of all European. So, like, how did the US become significant in that story?
The US is always trailing behind in this period. You'll speak for today. The US is always emulating, France, England for couture, for hairdressing, perfumery, you name it. The hairstyling and hairdressing professionalizes in France and England well before it does in the United States. But the United States catches up. And around the 1880s, you start to get professional hairdressing schools. So, how does an industry professionalize? It sets up academies for training people. And so that starts happening in Chicago in the 1880s here in the US. And you also, the second piece of it is putting out professional journals, so the trade magazines. And you start to get those trade magazines like Hairdressing Journal, which comes over from England. And then you start to get the American version of it. And then you start to see a burst in products and more confidence in US hairstyling.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Yeah. And obviously, we took a lot of things from Europe and we could utilize them here and it could flourish here. It could become, whatever it becomes here. That's really cool. Going down this kind of rabbit hole, what were some big moments for you as far as like, I know you had mentioned hair in racism, and its part in slavery and stuff like that. So what were some significant moments for you as far as your research went?
Yeah. Just thinking just now about hairdressers' journals.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one day, I'll never forget it. I had set up a research appointment. So I'm here in New York City, set up a research appointment well in advance, months in advance, to go to the library at FIT, which is the Fashion Institute of Technology. It's the only library in the Northeast, at least, possibly in the US. I mean, talk about going down a rabbit hole. I tried really hard to find as many hairdressing trade journals from the late 19th century as I could. And so, as I explained, the industry is professionalizing toward the end of the century. So I only had a small window of years to try to find these journals from the US. And I made this research appointment. And finally, the day came. The librarian comes downstairs to get me. I get my, I'm in the lobby. I get my security pass. We pass the security desk. She takes me up the elevator. We go into this incredible study room. I'll never forget, like, the desk was in a U shape. There were like two other people studying in there, and she sat me down and the boxes were there waiting for me. So archival boxes filled with issues of Hairdressers Journal. I think some were called Hairdressers International, but it was coming out of the US. And there weren't
hundreds of magazines,
thousands.
No. Okay.
I wish. Were so, and this speaks to how important it is to get into the archives now and save what we can and gather what we can, and also thinking toward future generations of hairdressers, like save what you can, save your archives, like keep oral records of your years in the salon. These things are so important to keep. So I opened the archival box and, there were 3 or 4 volumes. That's fine. I was thrilled. So, I mean, they're yellow, they're brittle, the librarian's behind me and they're always, they're doing their jobs. They're watching over your shoulder, and I'm turning the pages and like the corners are coming off. That's okay. Better to look at them than not look at them. And I was completely transported. It was like, finally, I could hear the voices of the hairdressers from the period. There's no, for primary documents, there's no hairdressers journals. I study women's lives. So I, grasp onto any women's journals that I can from the period or letters. And that's how I learn about the period. But, to get to the other side of it and really hear how the practitioners were feeling and thinking and what their concerns were, these trade journals were the only way to get to it.
So can you give me any examples of like what they might
Yes.
have? That's interesting.
There's a whole letters to the editor section, and it's really like trade, like nitty gritty, where hairdressers are writing in and saying, I'm charging 35 cents for a shampoo in, Cincinnati, and in Cleveland, they're charging 50 cents, and we really need to regulate the prices. So there's this whole discussion about price regulation. It's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, there's so many through lines to today, and that's why I'm so, energized to hear from you and your listeners, the other hairdressers, to see like what resonates. They're trading at the time they would be called recipes for products, or hair concoctions were called receipts. So they were trading, receipts, again, with the egg yolks, like 2 egg yolks, 3 egg yolks, castor oil, olive oil. I mean, it does start to sound like a salad after a while. But the important thing is that it's a community and they're exchanging information. And this is happening on the pages of a trade journal. And so I think there are a few more copies of these hairdressing journals in a library at the University of Michigan. So hopefully going to get out there. And then as far as, as we were saying that in England and in France, there's a longer history of this profession. So there are more records and there are more journals. So the British Library is on my list, and they have a significant collection.
That is so cool.
I know.
So would there feasibly be a part 2 to this book? Do you think you could write it?
Part 2. Well, what I would love to do is my style of writing, and what I'm so lucky that my publisher is amenable to. So MIT Press is incredible, and they put my books. They find my books accessibly written. So even though they're researched to the bone, they are. I write for a general audience, and so high school students, college students, professionals, as well as teachers and professors can access the information. But what I would love to do is like a gift book where, I can get into a little bit more of the fun stuff, like maybe reproduce some of these hair product recipes, and then, even some letters to the editor from these journals. I mean, they're so fun.
That's great. That's great. Please use us as a vessel.
I will. Thank you.
It's really cool. You had mentioned earlier that early in hairdressing, the professionalism of hairdressing, it was kind of male dominated. Was there a discernible point where women started getting involved professionally in this industry?
As with most topics in the 19th century, women are constantly involved. They're involved in every aspect of culture. It's just that what gets recorded and what comes down to us is often from the male side, because the men are leading these organizations. So just thinking about these trade journals, the masthead, the people in charge of publisher, editor, opinion writer, those are all men. So those are the names that are there. But the people writing into the journal and the advertisements, you're seeing women's names there. And I track women in this industry and how they made, a livelihood from making hair products and from doing hair. And that's really what I try to focus on in the book. So as much as the men were in the official positions and were extremely important to the profession, do not get me wrong, make no mistake, the barbering profession, I mean, barbers, it's a huge topic. And I dip in and out of looking at the world of barbering because it's so well covered in a couple of other terrific books that study it deeply. And because barbering is a male profession, it was studied first. However, I found through my research that these aspects of the hair world were not as gendered as maybe we once thought they were. And women they're always part of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me think of how to ask this, but you gained obviously perspective on this hair world and women. Is there a particular way you would articulate how this industry kind of empowered women?
I think hairdressing was a path to empowerment for a lot of women. One of the figures that I follow, she's one of my, hero characters throughout the book, who I kind of weave in and weave out throughout all the themes is a woman whose name was Christiana Carto Bannister. And I came to her through her husband. This is often the story. It's fine. Christiana Carto Bannister was a hairdresser in the 1870s, 80s, and onward in the Northeast of the US. So we're talking Boston and Providence, Rhode Island. She is half she's African American and Native American descent. And she's married to Edward Mitchell Bannister, who is a landscape painter. So you can see the art history coming through now. I was studying Edward Mitchell Bannister for my, oral exams at the end of my degree. And, I don't mean to pick on landscape painting. It's not that I don't like it. It's just that, he's a good painter, but the landscapes just weren't doing it for me. And then anyway, so I got involved in researching his biography. And it turns out that Edward Mitchell Bannister started as a barber. He started his livelihood doing hair, but always loved painting. And how did he have enough time to quit barbering and turn to painting? Well, his wife, Christiana, was doing hair and bringing in enough money to free him up to do his painting. It's just an incredible story. And Christiana Carto Bannister, she's making her own products. She owns what we would call salons in 2 different cities at the same time. She's traveling back and forth on her own without her husband, putting out products, training her nieces to make the products. And eventually they would end up selling the products after Christiana passed away. Edward Mitchell Bannister, her husband, passed away before her. I mean, the legacy of this. And it turns out that her brother's family owned a wig store. I mean, there's so much to find, but it's not all recorded in the places that we necessarily in one, neat little bundle. So we have to go into, these different pathways and these rabbit holes, if you will, to find them. A lot of newspapers help with tracking her life.
How does someone in your position whittle down what is important to cover in a book like this versus it's probably all fascinating. So how did you decide what to keep and what to leave out?
It's really hard. What you end up doing is having like a few Google Docs that say cut one, one doc called cut one, cut 1, cut 2. It's really painful to cut the information out. But the reason why I love doing, talking, on shows like this and with you is that I get to bring in some of the material that, landed on the cutting room floor, didn't quite, fit a theme. And, just some of these little details like, Christiana Carto's, nieces who ended up selling her products after she died. I mean, I haven't even gotten into these nieces yet. I have more work to do.
Wow, that's so cool. It's so great. Lost Hairdressers historically has been really kind of more about editorial styling. That's kind of like where we do haircuts and salon stuff a little bit, but mostly it is about photography and editorial styling. Had you seen in your research, how much were you seeing hairstyles evolve or change? And what do you think was the big influencers on why it was changing? Especially, we're talking about a time with no TV and no social media, so how did these things evolve? Did you have any perspective on that?
It's always the actresses.
Yeah.
The styles start with the actresses, and they're the ones that are being reproduced. Their images being reproduced in photographs and newspaper, depending on the time. We're still talking 1860s to 1900, but things in publishing are changing so quickly, and image reproduction is changing so quickly. So in some cases, we're talking engravings or etchings that are reproduced in newspapers of actresses, and you can see their hairstyles. in some cases, you later in the century, you get, photographs that are either reproduced in periodicals, fashion magazines, basically like editorial work, or on what we call trade cards, which were essentially photographic, like carte de visite. So it's like kind of a souvenir. So if there was an actress, and many of these actresses again are coming in from France, England. So I'm talking about Sarah Bernhardt and Lily Langtry are two of the better known names. So their image is being reproduced on these souvenir cards that were reproduced in multiples, and you could buy them. And even if you lived in Minnesota or something and you couldn't get to a show in one of the major cities, you could still buy a souvenir card and have the image of the actress in front of you, so you could keep up with how they were styling their hair from year to year in different theatrical productions. So the actresses are always the ones driving they're the fashion forward figures. And the way they style their hair disseminates through the press, these different ways that I'm talking about, to the middle class and to the lower class women. And then it's this cycle of emulation again.
So pardon my ignorance, but were these actresses, were they European and coming over, like, and we were watching them from here? Okay. So their hairdressers were European, and then we were getting that dissemination from here.
Yeah. I mean, there's going to be some gray area. So, because, these actresses were famous. So Sarah Bernhardt and Lily Langtry coming over from France and England, and they were extremely popular. They're in theatrical shows in the major US cities. So who decided what their hair would look like? When they're on a British stage, they probably had a British hairdresser. When they're in New York, they probably had a New York hairdresser. And probably there was a lot of conversation happening. So, this is what I love about, historical women's lives so much, is that they were talking and having conversations in that moment, the way we have conversations with our hairdressers and with, magazine editors and with stylists. So Sarah Bernhardt probably said to her hairstylist in, France, do it, give me like she had red frizzy hair, and she's in the book, so you'll get some really fun images of her. Do my hair frizzy and, make it big for this Shakespearean role I'm doing. And then somehow when she came to New York to do the same role, it got, slightly pulled back, or there was like a crescent barrette in it, so the hairstyles evolve, but they do disseminate from the most visible women, who would be the actresses. And then it's adopted by the middle class, and also like the upper class women dip into some of these styles as well. And they'll go like a little bit fashion forward, but not all the way.
So they weren't necessarily leading the way. Well, not leading the way, but as far as like absorbing a trend, they weren't the early adapters, the rich.
I wouldn't say so. And you can see this in their portraiture. And I show some of this portraiture in the book. And this is another fascinating aspect of how hair comes into the culture, is that, how does it come down to us in color? It comes down to us through painted, they didn't have color photography at the time. So it comes down to us through these upper class women's painted portraits. So what are we looking at when we look at a portrait by, say, John Singer Sargent of the upper, 1%, women in New York City, for example? We're looking at, a moment in time and a hairstyle that was chosen by the sitter, by the woman who's sitting for her portrait, probably by the painter, and probably by, her husband, and probably by some friends who were in the room too. Right. And one of the things that I discovered in the research is that women, upper class women, were choosing more conservative styles for their painted portraits, because painted portraits were so expensive. It was such a large investment. You're paying the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars for a portrait that's supposed to last for posterity, and you're going to pass it down generation to generation. And in some cases here, they're on the walls of our major museums. So are you going to pick like the Pompadour cut of, 1899? Probably not. It's going to be a lot more conservative so that it'll stand the test of time.
So that brings me to this question: like, were there some standout huge hairstyles that were culturally, like, cultural landmarks in your research?
I thought about this a lot along the way, because a natural way to kind of outline the trajectory of what I wanted to study in the period would have been to like find hairstyles that were big in the 1860s, what was big in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And there really are, I couldn't make that work. There are not as many standout styles as the 20th century, obviously, or 21st century. However, I can speak to two. So the one is called the Pompadour, and it's really like a front poof, and then it sort of tapers.
Okay.
And then the second,
on long hair, were you seeing hair behind the shoulders or in front of the shoulders?
always pulled back at the lower,
Okay.
always pulled back.
So
so like at the lower neck.
Okay.
And then the second big one is the bouffant, which is like really like spherical, and it's circular, it's puffy, it's like air filled. So and I show a couple of images of this style in the book. It's super fun. It's right around the turn of the century. So, people are, women are like, all right, it's, almost 1900, time for the new us. And you get this, this type of woman that was called the new woman, capital N, capital W. So the new woman figure is a woman who is like young, healthy, fit, who exercises, who rides bicycles, and who plays tennis, and who plays cricket, and looks like, $1 million while they do it. And so this hairstyle, the bouffant, comes in right around this moment. And one of the great correlations that some of the newspapers and caricatures especially make is between like the like pneumatic tires and bicycles and the air that's filling this bouffant hairstyle. I mean, who knows what was under there? I mean, they did use probably many of the same tools that you all use now, but one was called a rat. Do you still call it a rat? So
yeah, tell me what it is. I mean,
so they called it a rat, and it's so it's like a piece of fabric over stuffing, so like straw or something like that, so that you could build up the volume in a certain hairstyle. So for the Pompadour, the rat would be like up above the forehead, and for the bouffant, there's probably like 3 or 4 of those things underneath the swooped up hair.
Yeah, absolutely. There's still plenty of equivalents to that.
Okay, there's like a lot of equipment.
There's it wouldn't be crazy to see like extra hair bundled up inside of like a wig cap, to make the same thing, and they pieces that kind of function as that, to not have to make something that actually looks like a rat.
I know. I haven't seen any of these things exist. I mean, that's another thing about hair, and major point that I make in the book is that hair is ephemeral. We don't have the actual hairstyles come down to us the way that we have, say, the dresses, by the House of Worth, or, that are in museum collections, that we can actually see like the beauty and the color. It's very rare when you get an artifact that's actually hair for the head. Memorial hair work is a totally different topic, or hair jewelry, totally different topic. Excellent topic, great books on it. I do set that aside. But there are some incredible existing hair curls that exist. So there's like one set of red curls. They're incredible in the Victorian Albert Museum. And I reproduced that in the book. And since then, talk about like needing another small book to show some of these incredible artifacts. I found like there are, once you get deep into some of these historical society collections, you start to find like wigs um, and real like cuts of curls.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then that's, it's real human hair, I'm assuming.
Those are real. Those are real human hair, but there is a whole world of artificial hair that is put out into the market, as well as I know you probably see today. So the real authentic human hair was incredibly expensive, depending on what color you wanted, and then depending on what you could afford, it might be supplemented with non-human hair.
So that does bring up another subject. What about, how were people coloring hair back then?
There were really interesting recipes for hair dye, and apparently many of them were kind of dangerous, with, I guess, like petroleum in them and flammable flammable ingredients. But all of the women, all of the men and women who were, hustling their own products, they would claim on their product labels that theirs was all natural and not dangerous and, non-flammable and safe to use. But hair dye, I mean, this is where I would love to like, get together with hairdressers, like on a panel or something, and like really get into the recipes and see what they were using and like what they were using it for. I think some of the dye was dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. You could always just go with it and just be like, it's dangerous to look this good, just
Yeah, that's so true.
like it takes real sacrifice to look this good.
I know, it's so funny because like these product packages will say like, no chemicals, and then like it's all chemicals.
What else is
Yeah, because there wasn't like the FDA. There weren't like these regulations the way there are today. So that's one of the really fun parts of the research is going through the advertising.
I don't know if this is covered in your book, because I haven't got to read it yet, but I certainly will.
No, y'all can pre-order it now.
Yes, and we will put all that info out there. But I know you covered just a certain amount of time in this book, but two things. So I'm curious about how salons came about as we know them. Number one, and I remember in that interview I listened to with you, you mentioned Lynn Tariq, was it?
Oh, Lynn Tariq, yes.
Yeah. So I would love to hear more about this character, because I don't know if even that it's a man or a woman, or so.
Yes. Okay. So Lynn Tariq was one of the super fun discoveries in the world of hair. So this is a French character.
How do you spell it? Lynn?
Okay, so it's Lentheric, and there's an accent on Lenteric, so there's an accent on the second E, but I will give you that. And it's also like I do kind of a preview into Lenteric in my first book, Dressing Up. And cool. So you can see the incredible interiors of his building. So Lenteric was one of the great, hairdressing entrepreneurs in France in the late 19th century, working with all the great, couturiers. And talk about editorials. So French fashion magazines and fashion plates in these magazines are so beautiful. Any time you get a chance to, well, you can look at a lot of them online too, but to see them in person is just like such a treat. They're, hand watercolored by hand, these beautiful fashion plates, which are the equivalent of like a fashion spread in a magazine. So it'll be an image of a model woman, kind of like a generic, white woman, wearing a fashion of the moment by one of the big name designers. And then in these fashion plates, they'll say who made the dress, they'll say who did the hair, who did the perfume, who made the shoes, made the corset. And I kept seeing in my research that this name Lanteri kept coming up and was often paired with the House of Worth, which was one of the most famous dress designers of the day. And then I found that, he had this huge, he had this building like in the middle of Paris in the most exquisite area, the most fashionable area of Paris. And you could get your hair done there. He had running water. He had like all the latest plumbing. And there are these, he redoes the building and renovates it and then gets this huge like spread and a fashion magazine talking about all the accoutrements he's put in there. And he has one of the earliest hair dryers in there. So, I mean, if you look at the image of that, it's like this huge apparatus that was on wheels. You could wheel it over to your client. So you can see like clients had privacy. There were like, what you would call like a screen in between the chairs, and you could wheel over the hair dryer. It's all so good. And then he also did perfume, and he had a whole perfume factory in the basement where, men were like mixing perfumes in these big barrels. So you can see the interrelationship between all these professions, and none of them were secondary. They were all equal to each other, and they were all keeping the industries afloat. So that's happening in France, and that's in the US too. Like I said, if you were Mrs. Astor and you were going to the opera and to a ball on a Monday night in Midtown, and you didn't have your hair done, you weren't going anywhere.
Right. Wow. I think that's really notable because, like we were saying earlier, hair as a profession can get marginalized, but it doesn't take long to see how big of a piece of the puzzle it is in pretty much everyone's life. It's almost the equivalent of food. It is part of our culture, and it's an important part. And I love the idea of that, being more understood, being more considered.
Yes. And there's so much more to do. And, we all need to collaborate together to get some of these histories down. And, 20th century has certainly more books about hairdressing than 19th century does. And so I'm bringing that story back.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me, did Lynn, was there any sort of legacy that followed after his time?
I think that the perfume lasted. I think I have the year. I will get the year. I think it's in my first book. I think the perfume lasted into the 20th century and then fades out, but you will see perfume bottles, but not hair products. You don't see those going. Yeah, I mean, we need more records. When business records don't last, it's really difficult to track. What you end up doing is tracking advertisements in the newspapers and the magazines to see when they start to fade out.
Got it. That makes sense. What was significant? You mentioned the plumbing.
Yeah.
So what was so significant about Len's salon having plumbing versus salons that didn't?
Right. So Europe being so much older than the United States, Europe does not have as much plumbing and running water coming into homes and businesses the way that the United States had more of that. So it was a big deal in France. If you had running water in your salon, you were, the elite, you could do what they called wet shampooing. So you could shampoo your client. And what they would do in that period, you can see it in the images, and you can see this in a lot of the barbering manuals as well, is that they would wash the hair, so the sinks in front of the client, and then the client flips their head over, and they're straining their neck forward rather than backward, and getting their hair washed that way into like a sink or a bowl, but with like water coming through a faucet. And whether or not there was like a hose with a spray, that part I don't know, but running water was a big deal, and you could charge more money if you had that plumbing available in your proto salon. We'll just call them salons for now. And the US had more of that. So what you see in the literature is that wet shampooing is associated with the United States, and dry shampooing is more traditional and associated with France and Europe in general. And dry shampoo is similar, probably you're going to tell me, to what we use today. So it was powder based, and you would put the powder at the hairline and comb. Like, I mean, they just love to comb this powder through their hair to pick up dirt and perspiration. And that was what they would call like a dry shampoo.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. When I started doing hair in the early 2000s, and dry shampoo hadn't quite made its comeback. I mean, it existed, but now it is a styling tool just like everything else. It's on your right hand at the salon, and if you're on set, you've got it there too. It's kind of made a total comeback.
Yeah, I see. I follow these product lines because I love hair, love to hair products. But I see like all the new lines like have a dry shampoo as like central to, what they're about. And everything's so cyclical. Everything just comes back around again. But powder was the initial way that people cleaned their hair.
Yeah.
And got the oils. Yeah, it worked. I guess it got the oil.
It actually does work.
I guess it got the oils out. All the etiquette manuals say comb, like just comb till the day's end.
I remember learning the significance of that. I was on set. I was an assistant on set out here in LA, and the model had oil in her hair, and we couldn't wash it, and I knew what dry shampoo was. I'd never really put it to work, okay. Maybe used it as a styling product.
Yeah.
But we spent probably 30 minutes spraying, combing it out, and it worked. We were able to
do the job. Yeah.
And so.
Yes. And then in certain time periods, you would get pink powder, like in light blue powder. So you get like these trends where people would put like colored powder in. It's really cool.
That is cool. So around what time was that? Was that late?
That's earlier. That's really fun. That's earlier than what I look at in the book, but I can't resist mentioning it because you get these like huge 18th century styles, and you see these in portraits. They were captured in some portraits, and they're light pink hair. It's so great.
That's awesome.
I know.
Really cool. I'd love to see that. So tell me, so you've got all of this research and hair history in your brain. What have you picked up from your own hairdresser? Mr.
B.
Yeah, tell me about Mr. B.
My beloved Mr. B. This is a long relationship, and it, really what I think about is, the emotional intelligence, like the strong, like interpersonal skills that hairdressers have today. And that's how you keep your clients. Our Mr. B and I are going on 20 years together. I've followed him from, his initial training studio to then he became an instructor, and I used to go and get my hair done where he was teaching, and that was in Union Square. He was at an academy, and he was in charge of all these. He was in charge. He was in charge of all these students, and I would, watch him teach the students. Then he would come do my hair, and then go catch a student doing something with a test model or And so I watched that, and then he's moved on to a different place now, and we still see each other. But he's one of the guiding lights in this research. And I tell him that all the time, is that, you know, the hairdresser client relationship, it's, you know, that's the legacy, I think, of the industry. And you see that in, you know, all joking aside, but the, you know, the letters to the editors are like these crazy stories in the newspapers from the late 19th century. These are relationships the same way they are today. And, you know, if a relationship soured, then someone, you know, a client would move on to someone else. But you do read about people with their, you know, beloved hairdressers and the ones that they sought out the most. And some of the most fun stories are about the most sought after hairdressers in New York City, for example, who were so in demand on special occasion evenings that they would need to start their appointments at 7 a.m. And the event wouldn't be starting until 9 p.m. But if you didn't get, you know, like a late afternoon appointment, you were stuck getting your hair done at 7 a.m. And it's like, I think about the Met Gala and, you know, like some of these celebrities who, you know, are standing stick straight because they don't want to move their hair before they get to the event. And I can only imagine, you know, getting your hair done at 7 a.m. with an elite hairdresser in New York, and then like waiting all day to go to the event at 9 p.m. But it was worth it. It was worth it. If you had that relationship, then, you know, you stuck with your guy or your woman.
Sure. So Mr. B, huh?
That's Mr. B. Yeah.
Are you in Manhattan?
I am. Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah. That relationship is something that, it's an amazing aspect of being a hairdresser, and just the fact that you said you've been with him 20 years. You know, I've been doing hair for 23 years, and I have clients that, you know, were early in high school and now they're parents and doctors, and you're kind of just an adopted part of the family. And it's a relationship that's been crafted outside of the typical way, you know. But I always say you get to share, like, how often do you just spend an hour plus with one of your family members, or even like a close friend where you just one-on-one, you just chatting. I
think about that all the time. I mean, I spend time with I see Mr. B more often than close friends, right? Because that's like a sacred appointment. Like, you keep that appointment, and you know, depending on what you're getting done, you know, it could be a good 2.5 hours that you're in there chatting with each other and learning, you know. And people, you know, go through all stages of life, you know.
Man, absolutely.
During that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a privilege to be able to do that. It's really cool. Well, thanks for spending so much time on something that we all love so much.
I love it so much. It's such a passion topic and a passion project.
Can you give the name of both of your books? Just two, right?
Two, yes. So the new book, which is coming out, and I can't wait until you all see it. You can, the book is available everywhere books are sold, and it's called Beyond Vanity: The History and Power of Hairdressing. Okay, and then my first book I happen to have right here, and the first book is Dressing Up: The Women Who Influenced French Fashion, and you will get a taste of the hairdressing in there as well. And the books go really well together as a duo.
Awesome. It's so cool. I'm so excited to get those and read them. And I know our audience will be stoked on it as well.
Thank you. And come find me on Instagram as well. It's my name, Elizabeth L. Block. Would love to see you there. And I post some really fun present day hair related images.
Yes, you do. It's really cool. I like how you've approached your social media about it. And yeah, it's great. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. Maybe we could do a part 2 sometime.
I would love it. Thank you, Clint. What a joy.